What would you do if your baby was burning with fever and the pharmacist looked you in the eye and said, "No money, no medicine, not later, not tomorrow, now"? Eleanor Hayes had nothing left except a sick child in her arms and a town that stopped seeing her the day her husband died. But as she stood in the pharmacy, holding back tears and desperation, someone unexpected stepped forward. Benjamin Carter, a billionaire hiding in a quiet mountain town, grieving a loss he never talks about. He didn't know her. She didn't ask for help. But in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, and nothing would ever be the same. Now imagine it was you. Would you accept help from a stranger who's lost his way? Would you protect your pride or your child? This isn't just a story about a mother's love. It's about human decency, quiet healing, and the kind of connection that doesn't need words to change everything. If this story moves you, if you've ever needed help but were too afraid to ask, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Now, take a breath and let the story begin. The wind howled outside the small pharmacy in Silver Creek, Colorado, cutting through the early winter dusk like a blade. Snow fell in uneven flakes, blanketing the ground in quiet. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered gently, humming in rhythm with the old radiator that worked too hard for too little heat. The automatic doors slid open with a hiss, letting in a gust of wind and a woman. Eleanor Hayes stepped in, her arms clutching tightly to a small bundle wrapped in a faded blue blanket. The child nestled against her chest, whimpered, his cheeks flushed an angry red. Samuel, her 1-year-old boy, had been running a high fever since the night before. She had tried everything: lukewarm baths, a dose of acetaminophen she had left over from last week, but by morning, the fever had climbed past 103. Her fingers were numb from the cold, but her voice trembled from fear more than frost. The pharmacy was nearly empty. A teenage clerk stood behind the counter, typing on a computer, headphones dangling from his collar. A couple in their 60s browsed the cough medicine aisle, speaking softly in Spanish. None of them turned to look. That was fine. Eleanor was used to being invisible. She walked to the counter, feet heavy, her breath shallow. Samuel let out a soft cough, a raspy rattle that tore at her from the inside. "Hi," she said, her voice barely audible. "I need amoxicillin. The children's suspension. Please." The clerk glanced up, startled by her appearance, the worn-out coat, the wild hair, the desperation in her eyes. "Do you have a prescription, ma'am?" he asked. "No," Eleanor said quickly. "The clinic said they couldn't see us till Monday. That's 4 days away. He's burning up. Please. I can pay at the end of the week. I get a small check on Thursday. I'll leave my ID. Anything." The boy hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. He looked over his shoulder as if hoping someone else might appear and save him from having to say no. "I'm really sorry, but I can't do that without a prescription or a payment," he added softly, avoiding her eyes. Eleanor blinked. "But it's just an antibiotic. He's a baby." He shook his head, a little firmer now, like repeating a rule he'd memorized. "We're not allowed. I could lose my job." She stood there, not sure what to say next. Her throat felt tight. The warmth of Samuel's fever seeped through her sweater and into her bones. It was a kind of heat that didn't comfort, it terrified. "I'm not asking for a handout," she whispered. "I just want to help my son." The boy behind the counter said nothing. The couple down the aisle looked over, then quickly turned away. A silence fell, one of those thick, awkward silences where it felt like the world had decided to look away. Eleanor felt something break inside. She wasn't sure if it was pride or strength, or simply the illusion that she had more time. "I understand," she said quietly. "I'm sorry." She turned, hugging Samuel closer, and began to walk toward the door, the sound of his wheezing breath loud against her heartbeat. Her eyes stung, but she wouldn't cry. Not here. Then, a voice behind her. Wait. It wasn't the clerk. This voice was older, calmer, commanding. Eleanor stopped. Slowly, she turned. A man stood near the entrance, tall and sharply dressed in a long charcoal coat, with gloves in one hand and snow still clinging to his shoulders. His presence felt out of place. Not just because he didn't look like anyone from Silver Creek, but because he didn't look uncertain. He walked toward them, eyes locked on Samuel. "Is he your son?" Eleanor nodded, clutching Samuel closer. "What's wrong with him? High fever. Over 103. He's vomiting. I think it's a sinus infection." "I'm not a doctor," she added quickly, her voice defensive. "But I know when something's wrong." The man glanced at the clerk, who suddenly straightened like he'd been caught doing something wrong. "She asked for amoxicillin," the clerk muttered, "but she doesn't have a prescription." The man turned back to Eleanor. "Have you tried urgent care? They won't take us without insurance, and the clinic's full till next week." He looked at her for a long moment, not judging, just seeing. Then he nodded. "Come with me." Eleanor's body stiffened. "Why?" "Because I might be able to help." His voice wasn't warm. It was steady, measured, but there was something in it that didn't sound rehearsed. No pity, no superiority, just clarity. Eleanor hesitated. Samuel whimpered again. His forehead was slick with sweat. Without another word, she followed the stranger toward the back of the pharmacy. The hallway behind the pharmacy counter was narrow, lined with beige tiles and humming refrigeration units, the kind of place customers never saw. The stranger led Eleanor to a small consultation room, bare, functional, but warmer than the front of the store. He pulled a chair from the corner and gestured for her to sit. She hesitated before carefully lowering herself, still holding Samuel in her arms. The man didn't speak right away. He took out his phone and made a quick call, speaking in a clipped, low tone. "This is Benjamin Carter. I need Dr. Langley at the Silver Creek store. Urgently. Pediatric. Yes. Now." When he hung up, he looked at Eleanor. "I'm not a doctor, but I own this place, and I have some pull." Eleanor blinked, unsure how to respond. "You own the pharmacy." He nodded, and a few others. She didn't know whether that made her feel safer or more vulnerable. Samuel stirred restlessly, letting out a soft whimper. She tried rocking him gently, but the sound of his congested breathing had grown harsher. Benjamin noticed. "I've already sent for help. Dr. Langley will be here in 10 minutes. He's good." Eleanor didn't know what to say. Her instinct told her to remain guarded. She wasn't used to kindness that came without strings. Not in this world, especially not from someone like him, impeccably dressed, clean-shaven, with eyes that seemed to measure everything. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally, voice wary. He looked at her. "Because your son needs help, and because I can." Simple words, but they stirred something in her. Not trust, at least, not yet. But something close. Maybe the faintest spark of belief that someone still noticed the quiet kind of suffering. "I'm not used to people stepping in like this," she said. Benjamin's gaze lingered on her for a beat longer than expected. Maybe they should. Silence settled between them. Not awkward, but thick with the weight of all the things unspoken. Outside, wind rattled against the window, and the whir of the heater filled the space. Samuel let out another wheezing cry. Eleanor looked down, her hands shaking. The blanket was damp from sweat. Her heart clenched. "I should have done something sooner," she whispered, guilt slipping through her voice. "I thought the fever would break." Benjamin sat across from her now. He didn't say anything for a moment, just watched her with a calm, composed presence, not pitying, observant. "You're here now," he said. Eleanor nodded, but didn't answer. She was still trying to read him. He had that kind of calm that made her feel both comforted and cautious. Not cold, but tightly wound. Like someone who carried grief the way others carried watches, invisible, but always ticking. Then the door opened. Dr. Langley stepped in, a man in his 50s, with silver at his temples and kind eyes. He smiled at Benjamin, then at Eleanor. "Let's see this little fighter." Eleanor reluctantly let Samuel go, placing him on the small exam table. The doctor worked quietly, checking vitals, listening to his lungs, asking soft questions about when the symptoms began. "He's running hot," Dr. Langley said. 104 and change, congested chest, likely a respiratory infection, possibly with bacterial overlay. He turned to Benjamin. I'll prescribe the antibiotic and a fever reducer. You'll want to keep him hydrated and monitored closely if he doesn't respond in the next 24 hours. Hospital. Benjamin gave a sharp nod. Understood. Eleanor swallowed hard. Hospital wasn't an option, not without insurance. The doctor handed her a written sheet with simple instructions and placed a cool compress gently on Samuel's head. When he was gone, Eleanor sat back in the chair, rubbing her temples. Her exhaustion was more than physical. It was the kind that wrapped around your bones. You don't have to stay, she said softly, not looking at Benjamin. I know, he replied, but I will. And something about the way he said it, quiet, unfazed, made her eyes sting with tears she didn't let fall. She hadn't had a partner in anything for a very long time. Every decision, every mistake, every sleepless night had been hers alone. And now, a stranger in a winter coat sat beside her like it wasn't unusual at all. What do? She asked, when you can't tell if someone is being kind or dangerous. Benjamin didn't smile, but his voice was gentle. You listen, not to what they say, but how it makes you feel. She turned her head toward him. He met her eyes. And in that moment, something shifted just slightly, like a door creaked open, not wide, but enough for light to spill in. The snow was falling heavier now, casting Silver Creek in a slow, muffled silence. Through the small window of the pharmacy's back room, Eleanor watched the flakes swirl in the amber light of the parking lot lamps. She had draped Samuel's blanket over her knees, holding him close to her chest again, his tiny body softer now, breathing deeper. The fever hadn't broken, but it had stabilized. For now, that was enough. Benjamin sat across the room, legs crossed, one hand on his phone screen though he wasn't really reading. His overcoat hung neatly on the back of the chair, and his scarf was folded with the kind of precision that suggested he was a man who left nothing to chance. Yet, here he was, in a cramped consultation room behind a rural pharmacy, watching a waitress cradle her feverish baby. Silver Creek isn't exactly the place I'd expect to find someone like you, Eleanor said quietly, her voice raw from exhaustion. Benjamin looked up. It wasn't part of the plan. She waited, unsure if he would say more. When he didn't, she ventured. Are you here for business? He nodded. I own the Carter Wellness Group. We just acquired this chain 2 months ago. I came to audit distribution lines. Didn't expect to walk into a moral crisis. That last line was dry, almost sardonic. But Eleanor caught the flicker in his eyes. Not everything he said was a shield. Some things were confessions in disguise. She leaned her head back against the wall, her eyes fluttering closed for a second. So, you're the one with the power, she murmured. I have some, and the money. Yes. Then why do you look like someone who hasn't slept in years? That made him pause. Not offended, just surprised. Benjamin looked down at his hands, fingers interlaced. The silence stretched. Eleanor opened her eyes slowly, curious and wary. I lost someone, he said at last. A child, not mine, my nephew. I helped raise him after his mother, my sister, struggled with addiction. He was 2 years old when we found out he had leukemia. It was aggressive. His voice didn't tremble, but his jaw set a little too tightly. He died before his 3rd birthday. We did everything we could, all the resources, all the medicine, but we couldn't save him. Eleanor watched him carefully. No dramatics, no self-pity, just wait. A man wearing invisible armor forged from things he couldn't protect. I'm sorry, she whispered. He gave a single nod. After that, I left the company my father built, started my own, built something better, but the guilt never leaves. She understood that. Not the loss of a child, thank God, but the guilt, the way it nested in your chest like a bird you never invited, refusing to leave. I think it matters, she said, that you stayed. Most people don't. Benjamin looked at her, a flicker of something more vulnerable in his expression. I don't like helplessness, he said. So when I see it, I move, even when it's not your fight. especially then. Eleanor let those words sink in. She didn't know what to make of this man not yet, but she knew enough to recognize someone haunted by their own compass, and that, oddly, made her feel less alone. Samuel stirred again, whimpering softly. She adjusted his position, brushing a hand over his damp curls. "You're good with him," Benjamin said suddenly. Eleanor looked up. "I'm just doing my best." "It shows." They sat in a kind of quiet that didn't need to be filled, the kind that formed when two people shared enough pain to understand each other, even without the details. Then, Benjamin stood and walked over to the cabinet near the sink. He pulled out a plastic bottle of water and a clean towel, handing them to Eleanor. "For you," he said simply. "You look like you haven't had water all day." She took the bottle, embarrassed by how grateful she felt. "Thanks." He nodded, then leaned against the wall nearby. "You don't owe me anything," he added, reading her thoughts before she spoke them. "That's a hard sentence to believe." "I know," he said, "but I'm saying it anyway." She looked at him again. In the dim lighting, with snowlight reflecting behind him, he didn't look like a man trying to rescue anyone. He looked like a man trying to remember what it meant to care. "Is this your way of making up for something?" she asked. Benjamin's mouth turned slightly upward, but his eyes didn't follow. "Maybe. Or maybe I just couldn't walk out and forget." There was silence again, but this time, it carried something different. Not fear, not weariness, possibility. The town pharmacy, though modest and a little outdated, became a sanctuary that evening, outside. The wind sang through the narrow alleys of Silver Creek, but in the back room, a fragile kind of peace had settled. Benjamin had made a few calls efficient, quiet, purposeful. Within 30 minutes, the staff had transformed the space. A portable heater buzzed in the corner, casting a soft, steady warmth. A worn-out armchair was moved beside the wall, and someone brought in a small pillow, 2 cold compresses, a thermometer, and a thermos of chamomile tea. It wasn't much, but it was more than Eleanor had felt in a long time seen. She sat cradling Samuel, who had finally fallen asleep, his body still too warm, but no longer restless. The compress lay gently across his brow. Eleanor could feel the rhythm of his breath a little more even now, less ragged. Benjamin hadn't spoken much since setting everything up. He sat a few feet away, phone face down on the side table, hands resting in his lap, as though forcing himself to stay present, not in a rush, not checking stock prices, not calling someone to pick him up. That, perhaps more than anything, was what disarmed her. "You didn't have to do all this," Eleanor said, her voice low but steady. "I know. You could have just paid for the medicine and walked out." "I've done that before," he replied, tone unreadable. "It never sat right with me afterward." She looked at him for a moment, unsure whether to press further, but curiosity had always lived quietly in her. It just hadn't had much space to breathe lately. "Why are you really still here?" she asked. "I mean, people like you don't usually stay, not past the moment it's convenient." Benjamin's eyes lifted, but they weren't sharp. They were tired, human. "I could ask the same of you," he said gently. "Why haven't you given up yet?" Eleanor smiled faintly, a sad, knowing kind of smile. "Because giving up doesn't feed a baby." He nodded slowly, the corners of his mouth tightening in silent agreement. The tea had cooled enough to drink. She poured a small cup and took a sip. It was the first warm thing she'd had since dawn. "I used to think I'd have more than this," she said, not really meaning to say it aloud. "Not a mansion or anything, just a life where I didn't have to choose between medicine and rent." Benjamin didn't respond immediately. His silence didn't feel dismissive, though it felt like he was listening. "I worked 2 jobs before Samuel was born. I paid off debt, saved. I thought I was being smart. Then the medical bills hit, and the father." Her words trailed off. She didn't want to go there, not yet. "He left," Benjamin asked, voice careful. Eleanor nodded. 6 months into the pregnancy, said it wasn't what he signed up for. Benjamin leaned back slightly, sighing through his nose. Coward. That's generous, she muttered. A long pause settled between them. Eleanor shifted in the chair, glancing down at Samuel. His face had softened in sleep, cheeks still pink, but no longer fiery. Do you ever wonder if this world even notices people like me? She asked. I mean, really notices. Benjamin was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said finally. I've wondered that about myself too. Sometimes. That surprised her. The man in the finely tailored coat, with a voice that moved people like chess pieces, had moments of invisibility too. How could someone like you not be noticed? He gave a short, hollow laugh. Not being noticed, he said, isn't about being unseen. It's about being misunderstood. That stayed with her, in that little room behind the pharmacy, with the heater humming and snow piling outside. Something unspoken passed between them. Not romance. Not yet. Something older than that. Recognition. He stood slowly and walked to the small window, looking out into the snow. You know, he said, most of my life has been planned, scheduled, controlled, but today, I didn't plan to be here, and I'm not leaving because it feels like I'm exactly where I need to be. Eleanor didn't answer. She just looked down at her son, her whole world, wrapped in a blue blanket, and then at the man who had stepped into her storm, not with answers, but with presence. And sometimes, that was the rarest thing of all. The wind outside had softened, becoming less of a scream and more of a sigh. Eleanor noticed it only in passing. Her mind was elsewhere, floating between the fatigue in her limbs and the steady, rhythmic breathing of Samuel asleep in her arms. She hadn't realized how long she'd been staring at the wall until Benjamin spoke. Where do you go? He asked quietly. When you drift off like that. His voice wasn't invasive. It felt like a gentle knock on a closed door. She turned toward him slowly, half smiling. I go to the version of my life that didn't break apart. Benjamin nodded, resting his elbows on his knees. What does that look like? Eleanor looked down at Samuel, brushed a curl from his damp forehead. It looks like a small house with a working heater. A kitchen where I don't have to decide between paying for food or keeping the lights on. A backyard where he can run barefoot without broken glass under the grass. Benjamin's gaze didn't waver. Sounds like you had to let go of a lot. I didn't let go, she said. Life just peeled it off, layer by layer, until all that was left was this. She didn't say it bitterly. There was no sharpness to her voice, only the dull ache of someone who had learned to survive instead of dream. Benjamin leaned back in his chair. You ever think of leaving Silver Creek? Eleanor chuckled softly. With what money and to go where this town may be small, but I know which diner will let me sit and feed my kid without ordering. I know which neighbors leave hand-me-downs on my porch. It's not much, but it's something. He studied her face a moment, then asked something unexpected. Were you always this strong? Eleanor didn't answer right away. That word strong, it carried so many layers. People used it like a badge, but sometimes it felt more like a bruise. No, she said finally. I used to cry over spilled coffee, missed buses, bad haircuts. I thought heartbreak was when someone didn't text back. She paused, then added, but now I know heartbreak is carrying a child who's burning up, knowing you can't afford the medicine that might bring the fever down. Benjamin didn't speak. His silence wasn't empty, it was full of something else, something unspoken but heavy. I'm not brave, Eleanor whispered. I'm just a mother, and that means I don't get to fall apart. He nodded slowly, visibly moved. Then he stood, walked over to the counter where someone had left a folder of papers and a notepad. He picked it up, paused, then turned to her. Can I show you something? She hesitated. Okay. Benjamin handed her the folder. Inside were mock-ups, charts, and outlines of a program he had started building through his wellness company, a pilot project offering subsidized health care in rural areas. I've been pushing this through for months, he said, but it always gets stalled in red tape. My board thinks it's bad for profit margins. Eleanor flipped through the pages slowly. It wasn't just theoretical. There were implementation plans, testimonies from other towns, Budget proposals. Why are you showing me this? Because you're exactly the kind of person this is for. Someone who falls through the cracks. Someone the system forgets. She looked up at him, eyes narrowing slightly. So, I'm a case study now. Benjamin shook his head. No, you're a reminder of why I started this, of why it matters. A quiet moment passed. Then Eleanor said something he hadn't expected. What happened between you and your father? Benjamin stiffened, just slightly, not offended, just bracing himself. Everything, he said, and nothing. That's not an answer. He sighed, walking back to his seat. My father built Carter Pharmaceuticals, the empire, the money, the name. He believed in control, image, and results. When my nephew died, and I wanted to shift company focus toward patient-centered care, he called it weakness. Eleanor watched him closely. I walked away. Benjamin continued. Started from scratch. We haven't spoken in years. But I still hear his voice sometimes, especially when I'm about to make a choice he would hate. And helping me is one of those choices. It's the loudest echo. The heater hummed on. Somewhere outside, a truck rumbled past on snowy tires. Inside, two people sat in the middle of a story neither had planned to write together. You don't owe me anything, Eleanor said softly, echoing his earlier words. I know, Benjamin replied, but I owe something to the part of me that still believes in doing the right thing. Even if it's complicated, even if it costs. She exhaled slowly. Samuel stirred and whimpered, and she rocked him gently until he settled again. Then, without looking up, she asked, What do you want from me, Benjamin? Her voice wasn't defensive, it was tired. Honest. A question born from too many disappointments. He didn't answer right away. When he did, it was soft, measured, maybe just the chance to prove that not all men leave when it gets hard. Eleanor looked up, startled by the vulnerability in his voice. And in that fragile, uncertain moment, the kind that lives in the quiet between one breath and the next, something shifted again. Not trust, not yet, but the possibility of it. It had been 48 hours since the night at the pharmacy, but to Eleanor, it felt like weeks had passed. The fever had broken sometime early the next morning, and Samuel was now steadily recovering his appetite, returning in small spoonfuls of applesauce, and his giggles returning with the flicker of cartoons on the dusty TV in their modest apartment. Still, the exhaustion didn't lift, not from her body, not from her mind. And then, it came. A plain brown envelope slid halfway under her apartment door, no stamp, no name, no noise. She stared at it for a long time. Something about the stillness of it felt loaded. With trembling fingers, she picked it up, her heart already racing before she even opened it. Inside was a neatly folded letter typed, legal in tone. Her eyes skimmed the first line. This letter is to notify you that Jonathan Price intends to seek partial custody of your son, Samuel Hayes. She didn't finish reading. The words blurred. Jonathan. She hadn't heard that name spoken out loud in almost 2 years. He had vanished after telling her the baby wasn't what he signed up for. No calls, no visits, no child support, nothing but absence. And now this. Eleanor sat down slowly on the couch, her hands gripping the letter as though it might combust. Samuel was playing with a wooden train on the floor, his little hands clumsily guiding the wheels along the rug. He looked up and grinned, a streak of applesauce still at the corner of his mouth. She almost broke. The next thing she did was instinct, not thought. She grabbed her phone and scrolled to Benjamin's number. Her thumb hovered over the screen for half a second. Then she pressed call. He answered on the second ring. Eleanor, I need you, she said. Please. Just come. There was silence on the other end, followed by a low, firm reply. I'm on my way. 20 minutes later, Benjamin stood at her door. His coat was dusted in fresh snow, his expression quiet, controlled, but his eyes searched hers with urgency. She didn't speak. She just handed him the letter. He read it slowly, jaw tightening as he reached the second paragraph. He's hiring lawyers, she whispered. He says he has a stable income now, a new apartment, resources. He wants to prove he can offer Samuel a better future. Benjamin's eyes darkened. He abandoned you. She nodded. No contact, no help, nothing. He handed the letter back with care, as if it were a ticking device. We'll fight this, he said. You're not alone in this. But Eleanor pulled back, pacing the living room now, her voice rising. You don't understand. He has money now. He'll have lawyers who know how to twist everything. My apartment, my bank statements, the hours I work. He'll make me look unfit. Benjamin stepped forward, calm but resolute. Then we make sure he doesn't. And how do you know what it's like, she snapped, tears brimming. To be judged before you even open your mouth. To have everything you've done every night you didn't sleep. Every dollar you pinched turned into evidence against you. I don't, Benjamin said quietly. But I know what it's like to be used. And I know what it means to stand up when someone else can't afford to fall. Eleanor turned away, biting her lip to keep from sobbing. I can't lose him. Benjamin, he's all I have. Benjamin stepped closer. His voice was soft now, but laced with steel. Then we don't let them take him. She looked at him, her face streaked with pain, suspicion, and something else, something hesitant and searching. Why does this matter so much to you? Benjamin didn't answer right away. He took a deep breath. Because this is not the first time I've watched a child be taken from the only person who truly fought for them. Eleanor's breath caught. What do you mean? Benjamin sat down, speaking slowly. My nephew's father, my sister's ex, came back when the boy got sick. Not to help, to save face. He made everything harder, delayed treatments, took legal action to gain access. It wasn't about love. It was about ownership, power, image. He looked at her now, eyes fierce and glinting. I watched my sister break under that pressure. I watched her cry herself to sleep while he walked around telling people he was doing the right thing. He didn't lift a finger to save his son, but he knew how to look good in court. Eleanor's tears finally spilled over. And what happened? Benjamin's voice dropped. We lost the boy. And after that, she left. I haven't heard from her in 4 years. Silence filled the room, thick and unsteady. Then Eleanor whispered, So this isn't just about me. No, he replied. It never was. The room stood still, the wind whispering against the windows. Eleanor sat beside him, their knees nearly touching. She looked down at Samuel, who had now fallen asleep curled up on the carpet, his hand still gripping the tiny wooden train. I don't want your pity, she said. You don't have it, Benjamin answered, and I don't want to owe you. You won't. Then why are you here? He looked at her, his eyes steady and bare. Because I won't let you do this alone. 3 days had passed since the letter arrived, and Eleanor hadn't slept more than a few hours total, between court forms, notarized documents, and consultations with a local legal aid. She was drowning in unfamiliar terminology and the gnawing fear that none of it would be enough. Benjamin, true to his word, had not left her side. He brought a new stroller when hers broke, left home-cooked meals at her door when she forgot to eat, made calls to attorneys in Denver who didn't flinch at high-profile cases. But this wasn't just high-profile, it was personal. And today, it got worse. Your ex's legal team has filed for an expedited hearing, Benjamin said, placing a folder on her kitchen table. They claim urgency based on the child's medical condition and the need for stable, two-parent support. Eleanor's stomach clenched. That's exactly what I feared. They're using Samuel's illness as leverage. Benjamin didn't reply right away. His jaw had tightened the moment he walked in. There's something else, he added quietly. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. But Benjamin sat down slowly. The air around him shifted. He was composed, but there was weight in his silence. My father is involved. Eleanor blinked. Your father? Benjamin nodded, his expression unreadable. Harold Carter. He's funding Jonathan's legal campaign through a holding company. Indirectly, but the trail's clean enough to confirm it. She stared at him, trying to wrap her mind around it. Why would he? Because he's trying to get to me. Eleanor shook her head, confused. What does this have to do with you? Benjamin's voice was low, steady. I walked away from the Carter pharmaceutical empire. Publicly. It embarrassed him. He's been trying to force my return ever since. This, he tapped the folder, is his way of reminding me what power looks like. The kitchen felt colder, though the space heater still hummed in the corner. Eleanor stood slowly, pacing, holding her elbows like a shield. So, I'm not just fighting my ex. I'm fighting your father, too. Benjamin rose to meet her eyes. You're not fighting them alone. She exhaled sharply. Do you realize what this means? Benjamin, they're going to dig into everything. My pay stubs, my missed bills. They'll twist my parenting into negligence. They'll try. And if they win, he stepped closer, not with pity, but resolve. Then they'll learn what it means to lose something money can't buy. Eleanor bit her lip, staring down at her chipped kitchen floor. I can't afford a war. Benjamin, I don't have the stamina, or the clean history, or the friends in high places. You have me. She looked at him, really looked, and saw the tension in his eyes, the burden of a fight that went deeper than even she understood. What does your father want from you? She asked. Benjamin's gaze turned distant. Control, legacy, compliance. He thinks compassion is a weakness. He believes helping people like you makes me look soft. Eleanor crossed her arms. And you're okay dragging me into that I didn't drag you into anything. He did. A long silence fell between them. Then Eleanor sat down, suddenly too tired to stand. You know what scares me most, she whispered. Benjamin leaned forward. Tell me that they'll win, not because they're right, but because they can afford to be louder. He nodded, his voice low. Then we make truth louder, just then. Samuel toddled into the kitchen, clutching a toy truck. His cheeks were still pink, but his steps were stronger, more assured. He looked up at Benjamin, smiled, and reached his arms out. Benjamin froze, as if the gesture startled him more than any courtroom threat could. He knelt slowly, scooped Samuel into his arms, and something in his expression, an ache, a softness, a need unfolded in silence. Eleanor watched them. Something inside her cracked open. She wasn't sure what this was yet. Not love, not trust, but something undeniable, a force, a tether. Benjamin looked up, still holding the boy. I made a call this morning. He said, I've hired Mark Teller. He's one of the best family lawyers in the state. He used to work for my mother before she passed. Eleanor blinked. Is he expensive? Benjamin's expression didn't change. Let me worry about that. I don't want to owe you, she said again, softer now. You won't, he replied. This isn't about debt. It's about dignity. She felt the tears rise before she could stop them. She turned away, embarrassed. I didn't think anyone would fight for us. Not really. Benjamin stood, holding Samuel like he'd done it 100 times. Well, he said, voice calm. You were wrong. The courthouse in downtown Denver stood like a cold monument gray stone, glass doors, the American flag flapping stiffly in the dry winter wind. Eleanor had never stepped into a courtroom before, not as a defendant, not as a witness, and certainly not as a mother on the edge of losing the only thing that gave her life meaning. Samuel was in her arms, bundled in a soft blue coat, his head resting on her shoulder. She could feel his warm breath against her neck, his small fingers tangled in her sweater. He didn't know what this place was. He didn't know the stakes. She did. Benjamin stood beside her, dressed in a dark wool suit and navy scarf. He wasn't speaking, but his presence spoke volumes. He had driven her to Denver, sat quietly while she fed Samuel in the back seat. And now, as the courthouse doors opened with a mechanical hiss, he placed a hand on her back. Whatever happens in there, he said softly, we face it together. She nodded, but her heart was thudding so loudly she could barely think. Inside, the air was still, too clean, too bright. A clerk guided them to the family court waiting area, rows of uncomfortable chairs, fluorescent lights, and people murmuring in hushed voices. On the other side of the room, Jonathan Price sat in a pressed blazer and polished loafers. He was thinner than she remembered, more put together. His sandy blonde hair was slicked back. His eyes met hers once and then slid away. Beside him stood a sharply dressed man with slick speech and expensive cufflinks, his attorney, and just behind them, like a ghost in designer wool, was Harold Carter. Eleanor froze. Harold was tall, lean, and quiet. He said nothing, but his posture was full of dominance, like a man who had never been told no. His gaze settled on Benjamin without blinking. Benjamin didn't move. His jaw set. "Don't speak to him," he said to Eleanor, under his breath. "He'll use anything you say." I wasn't planning on it. But still, she could feel Harold's presence like a chill creeping into her bones. Moments later, a woman approached, early 60s, African-American, with silver-rimmed glasses and the posture of someone used to commanding a room. "Judge Miriam Ellison," Mark Teller said, nodding toward her. "Smart, no nonsense. She won't be dazzled by suits or last names." That comforted Eleanor barely. The courtroom itself was quiet, polished wood and clean lines. Everything about it seemed sterile, impersonal, except her fear, which was vividly alive. Eleanor sat beside Mark. Benjamin stayed behind her, not on the record, not family, just there, and that meant everything. The hearing began. Jonathan's attorney went first. He painted a picture of a man transformed remorseful, stable, ready to take responsibility. He had a new apartment, a steady job. He expressed deep emotional distress for missing the early years, but claimed he was now in a place to provide Samuel with a secure, two-parent environment. Eleanor clenched her hands in her lap. Her knuckles turned white. Then it was her turn. Mark stood, measured and precise. He presented photos of Eleanor caring for Samuel during his illness, medical receipts, rent records, pay stubs, testimonies from neighbors, all carefully prepared. But then the judge turned to her. "Ms. Hayes," Judge Ellison said, her voice firm, but not unkind. "Tell me, in your own words, what's at stake here for you?" Eleanor's mouth went dry. She looked around the room, at Jonathan, at Harold, at Benjamin, then, finally, at her son, who had fallen asleep in his stroller with one sock halfway off his foot, and something rose in her. Not anger, resolve. "I'm not perfect," she began, her voice soft. "I've missed bills. I've cried myself to sleep more times than I can count. But I've never missed a doctor's appointment. I've never gone a day without making sure that boy knew he was loved." She took a breath. "Jonathan walked away when I was 6 months pregnant. He didn't call, didn't check if we had heat in the winter, didn't ask how I paid for diapers. Now that Samuel's better, now he wants to come back." Her voice didn't crack. It strengthened. "I'm not afraid because I think he's better. I'm afraid because he's not. Because he's a stranger. And Samuel doesn't need someone who shows up when it's convenient. He needs someone who never left." A pause. Silence. The judge looked at her long and hard, then nodded. "I have one more question," she said. "Why are you here?" Mr. Carter Benjamin rose slowly. He hadn't planned to speak, but his voice came clear. "I'm not Samuel's father," he began, "but I've seen what real parenthood looks like." He glanced toward Eleanor. "I watched this woman cradle her sick child when the system failed her. I watched her beg for medicine. I've seen more strength in her than in men with boardrooms full of power. She didn't ask for help, but she deserves it." He paused. "My father once told me compassion is weakness. I disagree. I think it's the only power worth anything." The judge blinked, surprised by his tone. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," she said simply. As he sat, Eleanor felt something shift, not just in the room, but inside herself. Maybe she didn't have a traditional family, but she had something rarer: conviction, truth, and someone who finally stood still when the storm came. The courtroom doors swung shut behind the judge, and for a moment, everything stood still. No gavels, no lawyers, no arguments. Just Eleanor, sitting beside the empty stroller, her fingers clenched tightly in her lap, and Benjamin standing behind her with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable but his body still a silent pillar. The air was heavy, thick with unspoken fear. Mark Teller leaned toward Eleanor, whispering, "We made our case. She's thorough. Fair. That works in our favor." Eleanor nodded, but didn't speak. Her mind replayed every word she'd said, every glance she'd caught from Jonathan, every twitch of Harold Carter's jaw. She kept asking herself the same impossible question: was truth enough across the aisle? Jonathan sat back with a smug expression. His lawyer leaned in, whispering something. They both chuckled. Eleanor didn't flinch. Let them smile. She had said what mattered. She had looked into the eyes of power and refused to look away. And if that wasn't enough, at least she wouldn't leave ashamed. The door creaked open again. Everyone stood as Judge Ellison re-entered, her robes moving like heavy waves as she took her seat once more. Her face was still, but her eyes were alive with consideration. She cleared her throat. "This court," she began, "has reviewed all submitted evidence and testimony. It is clear that while Mr. Session Price has recently made strides toward stability, there is a critical distinction between appearing ready and having demonstrated long-term commitment." Jonathan shifted uncomfortably. Judge Ellison's gaze turned to Eleanor. "Miss Hayes has, without question, been the sole and unwavering caretaker of the child. Despite financial hardship and lack of support, she has provided consistent medical care, stable housing, and emotional security." Then she turned to Benjamin. "This court also acknowledges the testimony and presence of Mr. Carter. While he is not a legal guardian, his willingness to support this family without claiming ownership speaks volumes about his intentions and values." Eleanor held her breath. Judge Ellison looked at Jonathan one last time. "Based on these facts, the court denies the petition for shared custody." A pause. "Full custody remains with Ms. Eleanor Hayes." The words hit like thunder, and yet so softly. Eleanor blinked, not because she didn't understand, but because she almost couldn't believe it. Her body sagged in relief, not in weakness, but in release. Like a thread that had been pulled too tight for too long, finally went slack. Beside her, Benjamin exhaled, just once, quietly. Across the room, Jonathan stood abruptly and stormed out, his lawyer chasing after him, but Harold Carter remained seated. He looked at Benjamin, his expression blank. Then, slowly, he rose, buttoned his coat, and walked over not to Eleanor, but to his son. "You think this was a win?" he asked, voice like cold steel. Benjamin stared at him. "I know it was." Harold gave a short, disdainful laugh. "You threw away legacy for a waitress and a child that isn't yours." Benjamin's tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I walked away from a legacy built on silence, on fear, on control." He glanced toward Eleanor. "And I'm standing with someone who reminds me what real strength looks like." Harold's jaw tightened. "You'll regret this." "No," Benjamin said softly. "You will." Harold Carter turned without another word and disappeared into the hallway. It was over, but it was also just beginning. That night, Eleanor stood on the balcony of her apartment. The snow had stopped. The sky was a deep navy, flecked with stars. Inside, Samuel slept peacefully. Benjamin stepped out beside her, holding 2 steaming mugs of tea. He handed one to her and leaned against the railing. "You were brilliant today," he said. Eleanor shook her head. "I was terrified." He smiled. "You were terrified and brave. That's the real kind." A long pause stretched between them. The air was crisp, but the silence felt warm. Eleanor sipped the tea. "I keep thinking. What if you hadn't walked into the pharmacy, I keep thinking," he said. "What if I had walked out?" She turned to look at him. There was no performance in his eyes, no facade. Just a man who had chosen to stay when everything in his life had taught him to walk away. She reached for his hand. Not a grand gesture, not a declaration, just presence. "I don't know what this is," she said. "Neither do I, but I want to find out." Benjamin nodded, his voice quiet. "Then we'll find out together." And somewhere in the middle of winter, in a town that barely knew their names, Something soft and true began to grow, not out of perfection, but out of choice. Silver Creek lay quiet beneath a blanket of fresh snow. The chaos of court hearings, long drives, and legal documents had faded into the background, replaced now by the soft rhythm of a town catching its breath after a storm. It had been 10 days since the verdict. Eleanor stood at the window of the small cafe where she now worked mornings. The light inside was warm, casting a soft glow on the polished counter and the framed photos of regulars pinned along the corkboard wall. Outside, Benjamin's SUV waited at the curb. He had been waiting patiently, consistently, not just in his car, but in every small way a man could, showing up with groceries, without asking, helping Samuel build snowmen in the courtyard, and never once pressing her to define something she still didn't have words for. Eleanor finished wiping down the counter, her fingers slightly stained with cinnamon and coffee grounds. She untied her apron, stepped out into the cold, and slid into the passenger seat. Samuel was in the back, giggling as he watched his stuffed bear bob with every turn of the wheels. Benjamin smiled. "You ready? Depends," she said, pulling on her gloves. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere quiet, somewhere new." They drove for nearly an hour, the road winding past pine trees heavy with snow and hillsides dusted in silver. When they arrived, it wasn't a restaurant or a lodge. It was a small cabin near the edge of a frozen lake. Eleanor stepped out slowly, unsure. Benjamin walked beside her, his boots crunching the snow. "I used to come here with my nephew," he said, "before everything changed. We used to throw stones on the lake, even when it was frozen solid. I thought maybe it was time for new memories." She didn't say anything. Her eyes roamed the clearing, the empty dock, the way the snow clung gently to the rooftop, like a quiet promise. Inside the cabin, there was nothing extravagant. A fireplace, a wooden table, a pair of thick blankets folded at the edge of a couch, and on the table, a picnic. Apples, soup, crusty bread, tiny cookies shaped like stars. Eleanor laughed softly. "You didn't." "I did," Benjamin said, removing his gloves. "Samuel deserves a celebration." They laid out the food while Samuel rolled on a rug near the fireplace, babbling to himself as if narrating an adventure only he could hear. For a while, no one said anything. They ate in peace. They smiled. And then Eleanor turned to Benjamin, her voice quieter than usual. "Do you ever wonder if we're too different?" He met her eyes, every day, and it doesn't scare you. Of course it does. She looked down at her tea, swirling it gently in the cup. "But you stayed." Benjamin leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because love doesn't always look like fireworks. Sometimes it looks like showing up, quietly, again and again." She blinked, and something warm pricked the corners of her eyes. Then he asked her something unexpected. "Do you remember that first night at the pharmacy?" She nodded slowly. "I remember everything. I almost walked away." He admitted, "I was tired, angry at my father, caught in my own bitterness. But when I saw you holding him like that so fiercely, I couldn't." Eleanor swallowed hard. "You saved us," she whispered. Benjamin shook his head. "No, you saved me." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Outside, the sky began to shift from steel gray to soft lavender. Twilight was settling in. Samuel had fallen asleep, his small chest rising and falling in time with the fire's glow. Eleanor reached for Benjamin's hand, this time without hesitation. She didn't know what their future held. The gaps between them of class, of history, of pain were real. But so was the thread between them, not built on fantasy, built on choice. The choice to stay, to listen, to believe that maybe love, in its quietest form, could be enough. They stayed at the cabin that night. No declarations, no rushed promises. Just three people under a winter sky, letting the warmth of stillness carry them forward, not toward a fairy tale, but toward something better, something real. Sometimes, the most powerful kind of love isn't loud. It's quiet. It stays when others leave. It chooses to show up, again and again, even when the world says it doesn't belong. Eleanor didn't have status, money, or a voice anyone wanted to hear. Benjamin had everything except peace. But together, they rewrote what family could mean. This isn't just a story about a mother and a millionaire. It's a mirror held up to a world that still too often chooses privilege over compassion, rules over humanity, and appearances over truth. It reminds us that every day, people like Eleanor are judged not by their hearts, but by their paychecks. And children like Samuel, they pay the quietest price. So today, we ask, what kind of world do we want to build? One that turns away from those who need us most, or one that dares to love without condition? If this story moved you, let it move through you. Leave a like, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story that touches the heart and stirs the conscience. This was Shining Stories, where every story shines a light. We'll see you in the next one.